Today we'll prepare for Yud Shvat by learning the chapter, the Perek of the Friedrich Rebbe's Maamar, which correlates to this year. As is known that the Friedrich Rebbe gave out the Basi Legani מאמר for Yud Shvat Tafshin Yud. It was actually not one Maamer, but it was a series of a hemshech of 4 Maamarim. Altogether, there were 20 chapters in the 4 Maamarim. When the Rebbe took over the Nesias, Yud Shvat Tafshin Yud Aleph, the Rebbe in his first Maamer, Basi Legani, began to explain the Friedrich Rebbe's Maamer. He really explained mainly the first chapter, and then each year after that, the Rebbe would explain the following chapter in the Friedrich Rebbe's Maamer. So it was for 20 years explained each year a different Maamer, and this was the cycle that went on. And therefore, following that cycle, we're now in the 4th cycle, the Perek of the Friedrich Rebbe's Maamer, which is for this year, would be the 14th Perek. Now, in the beginning of the Rebbe's Maamarim, each year he would do a quick summary of Basi Legani until that chapter, which we'll probably do when we'll start the Rebbe's Basi Legani Maamer, but just to give us a little bit of context as to where this chapter is holding, and of course we're mostly familiar with it. The Friedrich Rebbe begins his Maamer with Basi Legani, explaining that Hashem's Iker Shechina, Hashem's main presence was in this world. And it was mainly drawn down through different tzaddikim after it was removed. And this happened specifically in the Mikdash and in the Mishkan. And the Friedrich Rebbe goes on to explain the karbanis that were in the Mikdash and Mishkan, and the avoid of bringing the Iker Shechina down, being the avoid of Eskafian and his hapcha of turning the shtus de l'umas, the shtus of the world, into a shtus of Kedusha. The Friedrich Rebbe goes on to explain that this is why it's the Mishkan was made of krashim oimdim, of standing krashim, and he compares the word keresh to the word sheker, that from the sheker, the falseness of the world, we turn it into a keresh. He goes on to discuss the difference between the letters based on a zoya, the letters that make up the word sheker, the kuf and the reish, which cannot stand on their own, and why the shin needs to be added there. And then he gets into specifically the reish and the kuf and how they're very similar to a dalet and a hey, but one is in kedusha and one is in le'umasa. And our avodah really is to transform that sheker into keresh. The Friedrich Rebbe then goes on to explain that this is the job of tzivos Hashem, that we are called tzivos Hashem. And then in the later Maamarim, he explains the idea of the army, and that the army's job is to fight a war. And he explains there are 2 types of wars. One type of war is simply to loot and to gain property and possessions. But another type of war is a war where one has an enemy which one must defeat. There's an inyan of nitzachon, one must be victorious. And this type of war, he says, is so important to the king, that midas nitzachon is so great in the king that he will do anything to win the war. He will go out and battle himself to the front lines, and furthermore, he will open up all of the treasures which he has been storing from his forefathers, the ones which are never ever opened, in order to win the war. And the same thing is true with the Eibishter, that we are in a war fighting against the sheker of the world, fighting against the Yetzer Hara, and in order for us to be victorious, and for the Eibishter to be victorious, he opens up his treasures, and those treasures, he says, are brought specifically to the ones in the front line, the foot soldiers who are really fighting the battle. What is this treasure that Hashem gives us? So the Friedrich Rebbe brings that this is what the Zohar says, that Or Ein Sof L'mayla Ad Ein Keitzu L'mata Ad Ein Tachlis, that the Or Ein Sof, which he explains is not just the Or of Ein Sof, but the Or itself is Ein Sof, is from the highest of levels down to the lowest. And really, Friedrich Rebbe went first to explain what it means that the Or Ein Sof is Lemata Dein Tachlis, goes to the lowest levels, in order to further later contrast it, what it means Lemaila Adin Kates. And in the chapter last year, the Friedrich Rebbe really explained how this Or Ein Sof, it goes so low, it's hispashtos, it expands to the lower worlds, to created worlds, to worlds which are coarse, to worlds which are physical. It even gives life to things that are klippos, that oppose Hashem, and that deny Hashem, and this is how far the Or Ein Sof can go. That's what it means, lamata den tachlis, to the very lowest of levels, it's there. And in this year's Perek, the Friedrich Rebbe now explains that what does it mean that the Or Ein Sof goes so low? It's not only that it creates something so low, but he says, V'ata mechayis kulam, it's still you who gives life to it all. That this ray from Hashem, which is giving life and creates yesh ma'ayin, is still connected to Hashem. And therefore, this chayis can be felt in the creation, that the Gemara says that the Eibishter is zon mefarnes mikane re'emim ad beit seikinim, that Hashem even gives life and sustains the eggs of lice, these tiny little things, that it goes so low, to such a low level. And this is also what it says, Im esak shamayim, if I'll go up to Shamayim, there you are, and if I lay down in Sheol, in the lowest of levels, you are still there. That the Eibishter is in the lowest of levels as well, and one can be misboinen, and one can see the greatness of Hashem in the creation of all of these lowly, a multitude of lowly beings. And the fact we can think about it, and we can come excited about it, is because this Or Ein Sof, even though it goes so low, it is still connected to Hashem, and one can see and become excited about the Elokus that is in this world. And that's because no matter where this Or Ein Sof goes, it isn't really affected by its surroundings. It doesn't change. It remains Or Ein Sof. The Friedrich Rebbe contrasts this differently than the way a neshama works with a body. When the neshama comes into the body to be mislabish and clothed in the body, it's affected by the body. It's affected by what happens to the body. This Or, though, which gives life to the world, doesn't become affected by the world. And although he says there is a level of Or which does change, that's the Or that's called, it gives chayis in a way of koyach. It's already is enclosed in the kalim of the lower worlds, which are a mitzias, and therefore it is affected by the worlds. But the Or itself, beyond the kalim, doesn't really mix in and doesn't become affected. This, the Zohar explains, is what it says, Ein Kadosh Hashem, there is no one as holy as you, Hashem. And the Zohar explains there are lots of things that are holy. Holy means removed. But they're not removed and as holy as Hashem. Because all other things, the kedushas that exist in Seder Ishtashlos, those things that are holy and removed, they're holy because they remain separate. But once they come in and get involved and and they're mislabish in the world, they're now in a level of tfisa. They're able to be literally grabbed and affected by the world. Whereas the Or Ein Sof, Ein Kadosh Hashem, even when it's involved in the world below and it's mislabish in the world, it remains separate. And it remains Ein Sof be'etzem. And he gives the example, the famous example that the Pardes gives of light going through colored glass. Although the Pardes talks about water and colored glass, but it gives the example of light going through colored glass, that the light still remains the same light. What comes out has the color of the glass, but the light that is in it is still the very same light and doesn't become affected at all. And he says this is the same thing with the chayis down below, that it doesn't become affected, and no matter how low it goes, in the lowest of madregas, in the lowest of levels, it doesn't become affected, and it remains that same pure, simple Or Ein Sof. And as he mentioned before, that means, and that in this world, it can be sensed, and we can see the Elokus in the world itself. We're going to get into the first perek of the Basi Legani Tov Shin Chaf Daled. There were actually 3 memorim that were said that Yud Shvat, which was the Shabbos. There was one on Friday night, one on Shabbos day, and another one on Moitze Shabbos. And unfortunately, the first 2 memorim we don't really have. The third mimer we do, I assume because it was on a Moitze Shabbos and it was able to be recorded better. Although some of the inyanim which the Rebbe spoke about in the first 2 maimarim, which were very similar maimarim were also included into this third maimer when there are some differences. So the first parak is going to be a summary pretty much like yesterday of the Friedrich Rebbe's maimer. And the Rebbe begins, Basi Legani achoisi kala, and as we know, the Medrash Legani Lignuni, Hashem says, I've come to my garden. It's my special place where the Iker Shechina originally was, down in Gan Eden, and through the Chetei Tzadas and other Averis, the Shechina was removed up into the heavens until it reached the seventh heaven, and then came tzaddikim and brought it back down. 7 tzaddikim told Moshe Rabbeinu, who is the seventh, called Shvi and Chavivin, he brought it down back into the earth, which was the main avodah. And this was through the avodah of Iskafia, and that leads to Ishapcha, and that caused the Istalik Yikar Dukujibrichu, which, as the Friedrich Rebbe explains, Istalik doesn't mean a removal, but Istalik means it was a Gilui on a very, very high level, and that's the idea of Veshachanti B'Soicham, I will dwell amongst them. There are two inyanim here, that Hashem will dwell, the Shechina in the Mishkan and the Mikdash, but then also B'Soicham in each one of us, that we draw down the Shechina and into ourselves as well, just like in the Mikdash and Mishkan. And that's why one of the avodas in the Mishkan was the karbanis, because the idea of carbon is kiruv, is bringing close what is above and what is below. The Maimer then continues and says that the avodah is one of the parts of the Mishkan is the krashim, which were atzei shitim oinim, made of shittim wood, and the shittim comes the word shtus, which shtus means veering from something straight. Now there's a shtus dilu umase, there's veering to the negative, and that's what a rabbi say, that a person only does an avera when there's a ruach, a spirit of shtus that comes into him, and the avodah is to transform that and turn those atzei shittim, the shtus, into krashim of the Mishkan. And this is why they're called krashim, because keresh, a beam, also has the same letters as a sheker, and we have to transform the sheker, the falseness of this world, and turn it into a mikdash, and that is a dwelling place for Hashem. And since the avodah is to transform the shtus, the nonsense of this world, which nonsense means it doesn't even make sense sometimes, therefore the avodah also needs to be not al pi seichel, not with logic, but we have to go for an avodah which is also doesn't make sense, which is above logic. Similar to what the Rambam writes, that normally a person should always choose the middle path in every single character trait or attribute. However, if he finds that he strays to one side, then you can no longer be satisfied with just choosing the middle path, but then you need to sort of correct that veering and go to the other extreme. And similarly here, when you're off the right path and veering towards shtus, which is l'umasa, which is negative, we have to correct that and use shtus, which is shtus tiktusha, serving Hashem beyond logic. And certainly to be able to transform the sheker, the falseness of the world, it requires this sort of avodah. And this is one of the reasons why those who do the avodah are called tzivos Hashem, because just like in an army, the soldiers have to go with mesiras nefesh in order to be victorious in the army. And if you don't have that mesiras nefesh, you will not be victorious. And so too it is with our avodah. And this avodah is for every Jewish person we are all part of tzivos Hashem. And like the Tanya says, that even akal shebekalim, even the lowest of Jews, also has the koyach mesiras nefesh, is ready to give him his life up for Hashem. And in the Maimon he continues that in order to be victorious in the war, there is there's a treasure that is given from above. And just like a treasure from a human king, that even treasures that he never opens, and even the ones that are not just his, but the ones that he's inherited from all his predecessors, that they are the most valuable treasures, and he doesn't even show them. In order to win the war, he is willing to give up and spend all of those treasures to attain victory. And the reason is because the attribute of nitzachin, of victory, of netzach, is deeply rooted in the soul. And the greater a person is, the greater and stronger and deeper that attribute will be. That's why we find that even Talmidei Chachamim have to have this attribute of Netzach, and certainly by a king who is the highest levels, higher than even all of the ministers. His midah of Nitzachon, his midah to be victorious, is incredibly strong. And that's why even these treasures that are never opened and never seen, he's willing to spend them all, and he gives them to the officers to pass down to the soldiers, because that is the ultimate intent, that they are the ones who lead to the victory. And even though it's the officers, the generals, they're the ones who know the military strategy, nonetheless it is the soldiers who actually are ready b'mesiras nefesh practically to win the war. And therefore, from here it's understood that in order to win the war and transform the falseness of this world into the crushim, the beams to make a mishkan for Hashem, we are given from above things that are not just a revelation, not just a gilui, but just like this oitzer, this treasure which is normally concealed and hidden, and the only one who ever gets to see it is the king, so to above Hashem gives us things beyond regular revelations, beyond even the highest revelations. And therefore, from here we understand that also within ourselves, that we have to be able to also serve Hashem in a way that's beyond the regular revelations, beyond Seichel, but we have to serve Hashem with Mesiras Nefesh, and as the Maimon will explain later on. Now, the highest revelation, he goes on to the Maimon to explain, is the idea of a Gilui which has no limits. Like the Zohar says that Or in Soif is Lamaila Adin Kates, above with no limit, Ulamata Adin Tachlis, and below with no limit. Meaning to say that although it is Or, it's a revelation, but it's not a regular Or, it's Or Ein Soif, it's unlimited. And he goes on to explain first the idea of what it means that the Or is Lemata, it's below Adein Tachlis, that even though the Zohar begins with the words Lemaila Adein Kates, we start to explain first the Lemata Adein Tachlis. Number one, the Rebbe says, because this is more Nageya to our Avodah. And also number two, by recognizing the Lemata, we can appreciate the Lemaila and then understand what we are given, which is even beyond this Gilui of Or Ein Sof. And he explains that what does it mean, Lemata ad ein tachlis? That means that the Gilui goes so low until this world, and in this world, not just in Kedusha inyanim, not just in permissible inyanim, but the Or even goes down to give life to the klippos, and even lower than the klippos is a person who sins, who's even lower than the klippos, and as is explained in Chassidus, that the klippos, even those klippos which try to coerce us to do the wrong thing, are really only fulfilling their purpose, whereas a person who sins is actually going against his purpose and is even lower than the klippos themselves, and nonetheless, he is still, the Or Ein Sof is still giving life there. And finally, in Perek Yudalid, the Friedrich Rebbe explains that Va'ata Mechayes Kulam, that nonetheless this Or Eliki that's giving a chayes and creating into being everything is still Ve'ata. It still comes from Hashem, and this is what it means that Hashem is Zonu Mefarnes. He sustains the Karnei Re'imim, the horns of these Re'imim, the greatest, this largest beast, and also Beit Seikinim, the eggs of little lice, that the Or and the Chayis comes down to the very lowest of creations. And this is also what it says, Im Esak Shemaim, if I will go up to the heaven, there you are, and if I will lie low in Sha'ul, you are there too. Meaning to say that even though these are inyanim, these are matters that are very, very low, as was explained, all the different levels, nonetheless, it is still you who give life to them all. Perek Gimel. Here the Rebbe explains that when it says Va'ata Mechayeh Es Kulam, when it says you give life to them all, the intention, the kavana, cannot be to Atzmus itself. And like the Alter Rebbe explains in Shar Yuchud Ve'emunah, that when it says Ve'ata Mechayeh Es Kulam, the word Ve'ata, Ata is Aleph and Taf, is which includes all the letters from Aleph till Taf, and the Hey at the end refers to the Hey Moitzai Sapeh, 5 different parts of the mouth which the letters are formed from. Now, obviously, this cannot be referring to Atzmus, which is above the idea of revelation and letters. And as we know that Atzmus itself has no name because it cannot be even hinted in a letter or even in the koitz, even in the point of a letter. So obviously, the Va'ata is not referring to Atzmus. At the same time, we know that it's only Atzmus which actually gives life and creates everything. And similar to what the rabbis say, Elov v'lo l'midosav, that it is only to He alone who we can daven to. Here we're not talking about the davening, but still it is only He alone who gives life to everything. Nonetheless, the way Atzmus gives life can be in 2 different ways. Or Atzmus itself directly, the way it is, or Atzmus can conceal itself in a or, even it's a very great or, but compared to Hashem, that great or is ukamhu, it is like dark, it is hidden compared to Hashem. And this is what it means when Alter Rebbe says that Ve'ata mechaya, that you give life, is referring to the oisius, meaning to say that the oisius that are in all of the nivraim, but the way Atzmus encloses itself and hides itself in those oisius, in those letters. And then he continues in the Maimer, quotes the Friedrich Rebbe, what he says that the ha'ara, this ray of the oraliki, is drawn down to create and to vivify, to lahachayos, to give life to all of the nivraim from ayin to yesh. Meaning to say that even though the pasuk says "Vata mechaye," you give life to them, it's not what the Alter Rebbe wrote in Shar Yichud Ve'emunah, that it says it's like a kriyuk siv. Don't read it as ata mechaye, but read it as mahava, you bring into being from ayin to yesh. And as also the Alter Rebbe himself brings, and what the Perush of the Baal Shem Tov of Lo'olam Hashem Devarcha Nitzav B'Shamayim, that the letters from Aleph to Taf of the Asar Mamaris are constantly standing to give life to the worlds in a way where they don't change, that's lahavos, to actually bring into being ulekaimam, and then to keep them sustained. Meaning to say that the orliki first brings into being and then continues to give life to the nivraim. And the idea is that when it comes to hishavos, bringing into being, and chayis, the giving life, there's a difference in revelation. And as explained elsewhere, that in regards to bringing something into being, the Eibishter wanted specifically that the hishavos, the creation of it, should be in a way where the one creating is concealed from the one being created. That way, the creation feels independent. It feels like there's nothing that preceded it, and he is a real yesh. Whereas when it comes to the chayis, the vitality, then when you are misboinin, when a person contemplates how he is alive, he can come to the recognition that there's something that gives him life. For example, there's a difference in regards to, let's say, the creation of the grass, that there's 2 ideas here. There's the actual creation of the very mitzias, the very substance and being of grass, but then there's all of the minute differences in the chayis, in the sustenance, and the vitality of different types of grass. There are some that need more water, some that need less water. There are some that need a hotter climate or a colder climate. And when a person thinks about this, he comes to the recognition that there is something that watches over to give everything what it needs in order to be able to live, to be sustained. However, through this recognition that there's something that gives it life, you can come to then the recognition, a deeper recognition, that there's also that something that creates it and brings it into being. That the yesh doesn't make itself. And this is why in the pasuk, clearly what it says is Vata mechayes kulam. You give life to them all, you sustain them all. But the libud is, we learn out, don't read it just as you give life, but you bring into being. And as we know the rule with al tikri, don't read it as such, but rather read it as something else, not that something else is coming to exclude the original way we read it, but it's coming to add. Meaning to say here that from the recognition that Hashem gives life and vitality, sustains the creation, we can come to a deeper understanding that Hashem also creates and brings into being the creation. And both these ideas, the Ishavos and the Chayas, are written in the same word, Va'ata Mechaya, because it's the same Or Ein Sof that first comes to create and then comes to give life. Perik Dalid of Basi Legani Tavshin Chaf Dalid, after explaining that Hashem's Chayas can be seen and understood even in the world below, the Rebbe goes to take it one step further. And he explains when it says, Vata mechaya es kulam, you give life to them all, that this includes not only the upper worlds and not only things that are in the realm of Kedusha, but you give life to all, includes even the klippus. And as we know that the entire mitzias, the entire being of the world, even klippus, follow a rule that ein yesh oises atzmai, nothing can create itself. And therefore even the klippus, we must say, are created and given life by Hashem. And this is what the ריכטר Rebbe brings in his Maimer, the proof from what it says that the Eibishter is Zonu Mefarnes, he sustains the Karnei Re'emim, the horns of these great beasts called Re'emim, and even Ad Beit Seikinim, until the eggs of lice. Now, Kabbalistically he explains that Karnei Re'emim refer to the greatest. Re'emim are the giant beasts, and Beit Seikinim, they are the smallest creation, and the same way it is physically, so too it is spiritually. And as we know that everything physical is just a reflection of the way it is spiritually, is created through that same spiritual koyach. And the Rebbe brings down from a Sefer Tur Barekes, from the Talmidim of the Arizal, that Kabbalistically Karnei Re'emim refers to what it's brought down in the Medrash, the Eser Krones. There's a Medrash that discusses 10 different times that horns are mentioned in the Torah and what they are. And he says that these Eser Krones, these 10 horns, they refer to the 10 spheres of Keser. And as we know in general, that there's the inner koiches, and then there's surrounding that, there's koiches makifim. Those could be signified by the skull that encompasses the mind, and then there's the keser, is something that's even on top of the skull. It sits on top of the skull, and here too the horn protrudes from the skull. So the eser kronis, these 10 horns, these are 10 spheres that are above the seder shtashlos. These are the spheres of keser, and which are a very, very high level. They are ultimate ruchnius, whereas Beit Seikinim, the eggs of lice, these are the lowest creatures spiritually as well, meaning to say that even in regards to their godliness, they are very, very low. And this refers, the Beit Seikinim, this refers to the klippus. And as brought down in the Prietz Chaim, that spiritually the idea of kinim has the gematria of 120, and 120 in Kabbalah terms is the amount of combinations one can make from the letters of the name Elohim. So it refers to Elohim, but not just Elohim, but Elohim in a way where it different combinations which minimize even the Elokus that comes through the name Elohim. Now Elohim in general, which also has the same gematria as Teva, is what conceals over and protects over the name of Hashem. So the name of Hashem is the godliness which is revealed, and Elohim conceals over it. And that's why it's also kinim. Also, this idea of lice has the same terminology as kinui. Kinui is a synonym or a nickname, meaning to say that instead of the actual name, you use a nickname. So instead of the name Havaya, it's sort of concealed by a nickname, Shem Elohim. And not only that, but the Rebbe brings down from a tshuva of the Maharik that the nickname is only considered a nickname when it completely deviates from the original name. There he brings down a tshuva that if you have sort of a English name which is very similar to the Hebrew name, then, or in any language which is similar to the Hebrew name, one doesn't need to include that as a nickname when writing Gittin or the such. It's only a nickname which is totally different than the original name. So we see that the idea of a nickname means it's ibud shma, it's a lack, and it's a loss of the original name. And this, the Mizritcher Magid also connects, or the Rebbe connects to what the Mizritcher Magid says about the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, Negad Shmo Avad Shmei. The one who wants to bring forth, spread out his name, will end up losing his name. The simple meaning is someone who uses the Torah to try to spread his name ends up losing it. But he says there's a much deeper meaning, that in order to spread your name, and here the idea of spreading your name is like our rabbis tell us that Hashem traveled a distance of 500 years, which we know is the amount of time or space between each world. So Hashem traveled to the worlds below, to acquire for himself a name. Meaning to say, in order to bring Hashem's presence down below, but negad shma, in order to spread out your name, avad shmei, that's by losing your name. Meaning to say that in order to bring down Hashem's chayis into the worlds below, Hashem needed to sort of hide his name through this kinim, through this kinoi, through a synonym, through the name Elikim. And therefore, says the Rebbe, that the idea of a beitzei kinim, the lice or the eggs of the lice, this refers to klippus, where they have been created through a large amount of tzimtzum, through Elikim, through different transformations of the name Elikim, until the name Hashem is totally at a loss, but nonetheless, even over there, they are still Hashem's chayis. Hashem still creates them. And it says the Rebbe, this is similar to what it says in the Gemara, Ein oid malvada, there is nothing but Hashem. And the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Chanina, va'afilu chshafim, even witchcraft, even things which are totally klippa, they too are nothing separate from Hashem. Perek Hey of Basi Legani Tafshin Chaf Daled, in the last Perek, the Rebbe spoke how Ur Ein Soif is Lamata Adein Tachlis, the idea of V'ata Mechayis Kulam, that even in the Klippus there is also a Chayis Eliki. And in Perikei, the Rebbe takes this one step further, and he explains that the Hamshacha is not only in the Klippus, but it's even things that are below Klippus. What is below klippus? That is when a person himself goes against the will of the Eibishter. And as we know, as the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, that is worse than klippus themselves. And he says this is what the Friedrich Rebbe brings in the Maimer, Im esak shamayim sham'ata vatzia sha'ol hineka, if I go up to the heavens, there you are, and if I lay down in sha'ol, often loosely translated as Gehenim, then there you are. That sha'ol, we know, is a punishment for those who transgress against the will of Hashem, and nonetheless, even in Sha'ol, there you are, you have the Ur Ein Sof down there. And as the Mittel Rebbe explains in Sharat Tzitzis, that the fact that it says, if I go up to Shamayim, there you are, and if I go down to Sha'ol Hinecha, that they said it together, it's said in the same pasuk to teach us that the same you who is found up in Shemayim, it's the same you mamish found down below in Sha'ol. And has explained that Hashem created everything zel u'maseh. For everything positive, there is a corresponding negative, and therefore, just like on the highest heights of Kedusha, there's a concept called se'aris, hair. And as we know that what it says, that the Atik Yoimin, that Hashem, who is the Ancient of Days, sits up in Shemayim, V'sa'ar Reishe, and the head of his hair, Ka'amar Naka, is like clean wool. That's there, he ties it into the idea of the talis and the tzitzis in Sharat Tzitzis. But that means in the highest levels, where the light is so great, because the light is so great, one cannot receive it unless it goes through incredible tzimtzum, which is the idea of the hairs, that there's a mind, there's energy, and then there is a skull which covers over that, and only a little bit of hair, these tzimtzumim, are what grow out from that. That is in Kedusha. When you have such a powerful Kedusha, you need incredible tzimtzum to be able to receive it. So too it is in Le'umas, and the other side, that we know also Besara Achidin, that the klippas are able to hold on specifically to hair. that when you already have a tzimtzum of a lekus in klippus, where it's already concealed, when you add on top of that a further layer of tzimtzum, these hairs, that's where the lu'umasa, that's where the klippus are able to get their life force. And this is why we find that sa'ar isha erva, that even the hair of a woman is considered to be erva, not tznius, whereas by a nazir we have the exact opposite, that he is kadosh, he is holy by growing his hair, and that's because the hair of a nazir is the idea of the sa'aris, of these tzimtzumim from kedusha, whereas other hair, if there's already an idea of tzimtzum and dinim already there, and then you add a further layer, then that is room for lu'umaseh. And this is what it, nonetheless, even in such a level, vatzia sha'ol hineka, even in the lowest levels, hineka, you are still there. And we find a similar phrase by Yoina in the stomach of the fish, that Yoina says, Mi beten Sha'ol shivati, from the stomach of Sha'ol, from the stomach of Gehenim, shivati, I called out to you, meaning to say that even in Sha'ol, he still recognized the elikus that was there. And furthermore, as Chana says in her tefillah, Merid Sha'ol, Hashem brings one down into Sha'ol, Vaya'al, and then he comes back up, meaning to say that not only is there likus down below, but in the Yerida so low, it's litzorech aliyah vaya'al, and as we know that the aliyah that comes afterwards is relative to the Yerida. And as we can understand that from the punishment itself, you can understand how great the aliyah is. And as is known, that in general, all the punishments in the Torah are not just as a punishment, because the Torah is all about chesed. Rather, the idea of the punishments in the Torah are a way one can rectify and return to good. And therefore it's understood. We can also understand this by what the Gemara says as well about Acher, that mutav dilidaine v'leisel alma da'asi, that it is worthwhile for him to go through all the punishments that he would have to receive in order to attain olam haba. That from here we understand that the whole point of all of these punishments, really to go so low, is in order to be able to get something even greater. And the Rebbe summarizes this parak by saying that from all of this it's understood that even in the lowest of levels, even below klippus, even a person who sins, and to the ultimate level where he uses the Torah itself to go against the Torah, which is considered to be the lowest level, nonetheless, even there's a hamshacha of Or and Sof, and we can all obviously take that within ourselves. None of us are perfect, and even in our lowest points, we need to realize that Hashem is there with us, and we have the ability to be able not only to break free from whatever is holding us back, but to be able, vaya'al, to be able to have an aliyah shaloi be'erech. Ois Vav, it becomes a little bit technical after explaining how Orein Soif Lamata Dein Tachlis, how the Ein Soif, the light of Hashem, descends to the very lowest of areas, into the klippa and things even below klippa, and nonetheless it's Ve'ata Mechayis Kulam. The Rebbe again quotes from the Friedrich Rebbe's Maamer from the 14th chapter, this year's chapter, and he says that the reason for this is because the Or is Ein Soif Be'etzem. It is intrinsically infinite, and therefore it's also infinite in how far it can expand. And nonetheless, wherever it goes, it does not change. Unlike when a soul comes into the body, that the soul is affected by what happens to the body, the godly light, which gives life and creates, isn't affected, it doesn't change at all through the creation. And even though we know that there can be a shinoi, a change in the or, when it comes enclosed below, says the Friedrich Rebbe, that's only when the chayis reaches a level, becomes something called koyach. There's a difference between, Chassidus explains, or and koyach, different forms of energy that Hashem gives. Or is when it's still connected to its source constantly. There's a dveikus in the makar, just like light constantly needs to be connected to its source. Koyach is a type of energy that separates from the source, sort of like koyach, when you throw an object, your energy, that koyach from your arm to be able to lift it up, gets enclosed in the object you are throwing, but now becomes separated and removed from your arm and can continue to fly through the air even though it's no longer connected to your arm. So there is an idea of change, and once that energy, so to speak, becomes separated. However, he says that the only becomes a level of chayis once it goes through the kalim of biyah, the vessels of the spheres of the lower worlds, because they are already considered to be a metzias. There's already a being there, sort of a other than Hashem. And as he brings down from Igeres HaKodesh, that same one he brought before from Tanya, that Yesh really begins from the Kalim of Biyah. They are the first Yesh, the first Metzias, and therefore there begins the idea of Koyach, and on that level there can be a change since the energy has already sort of had a disconnect. But in the Or, which we've been talking about until now, the Or Ein Sof, the one that gives life and vitalizes, that does not change at all. That's from the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Rebbe now continues to explain, based on a deep maamer of the Tzemach Tzedek, which discusses different opinions about the Eser spheres and what they are, that the reality is that even the Kalim, the vessels in Atzilus, even though they're called Kalim, they're not Or, nonetheless, even it's impossible that they have change, as he discusses there quite at length. And this is also based on an explanation of the Mittler Rebbe, based on a Zohar, where the Eibishter tells, there's a conversation there, I think, between the Eibishter and David HaMelech, where the Eibishter is invited, and he says, I will not even use my own garments, but I will only use your garments. And there it's explained that the garments, those are referring to the Kalim. My garments, which Hashem says, those are the Kalim of Atzilus, whereas your garments, those are the Kalim of Biyah. They're already not Hashem's, they're separated. And he explains over there that the whole idea of a kli, a garment, is gvul. It's a way to be able to limit and to be mitzamtzim something. However, we know in Atzilus, it's not possible that the vessel should actually limit the light, because in Atzilus, it's still Ein Sof. Atzilus is all Elokus and one with Hashem, and therefore the Kalim themselves are not really limitations. However, in order that there should be limitation beyond Atzilus, this is through the Kalim of Atzilus. And he gives an example. An example is the ability that a person has to write with his hands, which, of course, is through the fingers that move the pen, that even when you're writing one specific letter, so you're sort of limiting your ability to write, the reality is that the ability in your hand is to write many combinations of letters, to write lots of letters, and an infinite amount of letters you can write. You are choosing right now to be able to limit it, and you're only going to get one letter out when you write, but that hasn't limited your ability. And the same thing, therefore, applies to Atzilus, that Atzilus is the sort of creates limitation beyond. Later on, there will be only one letter maybe, but the ability that exists there is infinite. And he says this can be understood in Atzilus also, based on the fact that the Rambam says that Hu v'chachmasei echad, if Hashem is one with his wisdom, then certainly that can apply to there. The Rambam, according to some opinions, is literally talking about Hashem himself, and certainly that can apply to the Eser spheres of Atzilus, and as the Arizal explains that what the Rambam says that he and his wisdom are one certainly is true in the Eser spheres of Atzilus. However, says the Rebbe, we need to understand, in a person, that limitation from the ability to write to limiting it only to certain letters is because that ability goes through the hand. There's something that's creating that limitation. But by Hashem, there is no hands. There's nothing separate that sort of limits it. And therefore the Rebbe says that the reality is that even without the Kalim, Hashem has the ability, the potential for gvul, the power of limitation. And as the Rebbe brings down the famous Avodas HaKodesh, who says that if we say Hashem is absolute completeness, the same way he has to have infinite ability, he also has to have the ability to limit and make things finite. Otherwise, he's not complete. And therefore, this ability to limit really is a power of Hashem. It's not necessarily something that has to cover over Hashem. Practically, the limitation comes through the Kalim, but it already exists, the ability to limit before. And based on this, the Rebbe Marash says that that's how Hashem creates something negative. And as it says, Uboire Ra, Hashem creates evil, creates bad, that even though regarding Atzilus, we know there is no evil in Atzilus, there's no bad whatsoever, nonetheless, being that Hashem is infinite, therefore he has the ability also to limit, and that is what creates negativity, because the source of bad is the limitation, is the hagbal, is the tzimtzum on elikus. The lack of revealed godliness gives rise and potential for something negative. And therefore, says the Rebbe, summarizes from all of this, we can understand that in the kelim of Atzilus themselves, they're not real limitation, and therefore there's no real change, and Hashem is not affected by, the Ur is not affected by the Kalim of Atzilus. And therefore the Man and Deli, the my garments, are above any sort of limitation, and they are simply the power to be able to cause limitation further on. So this is again explaining when the Frierdiker Rebbe writes, "Ve'atam mechaya es kulam," this idea that the Or in Sof not only goes very low, but as long as it remains Or and not Koyach, then it is still completely one with Hashem in a way that no matter where it goes, it remains pure and doesn't change. We're now in Nois Zayin, after explaining yesterday how Or in Sof Lamata Dein Tachlis means that when it comes to the Or, which is Ein Sof Be'etzem, there is no change, and the only change that exists is once it becomes Koyach past the Kalim of Atzilus. Now the Rebbe really brings a few examples, life examples of such a thing. And therefore the Rebbe says that this also is Negea, what we said, Lahanhaga B'Poyel, practically. And we see this in the recent parshas, the difference between Yosef and the other Shvatim. That by Yosef, we know that he worked in the world. It says he came home to do his work, and one of the opinions says to actually do the accounts. He became second in command of Mitzrayim to the extent that nothing was done in the country without his approval, and nonetheless, he still stood in a great level of Avodas Hashem, like in the world of Atzilus. Whereas his brothers, it says, Vehem loihi kiruhu, when they first met him, they didn't recognize him, because their sort of avodah, they were shepherds. They had to separate themselves from all matters of the world, because those worldly things would disturb their avodas Hashem, and therefore they couldn't recognize such an avodas Hashem, that even though he was in Mitzrayim, Yosef was in Mitzrayim in the lowest place, but he still remained in the avodah of Atzilus. And the reason is because the Shvatim, as the Alter Rebbe explains in Torah, are on the level of Bria. And like we said, in Bria, there's a Metzias, and in Bria, there's already a Shinui. And therefore, there's a change. Whereas Yosef was on the level of Atzilus, and Atzilus, like we said, there is no change, and you're not affected by your surroundings. And this is what Yosef said to his brothers, Hatachas Elikim Ani, which in the simple meaning is, am I instead of Hashem? He was saying, don't be upset, I'm not the one who did this, Hashem is, am I in place of Hashem that put me here? But the deeper meaning was, he was asking, am I really under Elohim? Elohim, the concealment begins from Malchus Tatzilus into the worlds of Bria. He says, I'm not under Atzilus, I still remain in Atzilus, regardless of where I am, and therefore the world doesn't affect me. And based on this, the Maimer further explains that this is what it means we have in the words of our Chachamim, Golui v'yadua, the phrase, it is revealed and known before Hashem. Not that He knows, but specifically that it is known. That means it's known automatically. Hashem doesn't have to invest Himself into the knowledge. And the further explains, this is what the Rambam means. This is one of the explanations of the Rambam, who writes that Hashem is Hu hayoidea v'hu hayadua. He is the knower and He is the known. And what this means to say, the Maimer gives an explanation, as we know that there are two levels of da'as, of knowledge. There's das tachton and das elyon, two perspectives, one from above and one sort of a lower level. Das tachton is in a way of yoidea, where you're invested, you know you're invested, and that knowledge affects who you are. You're not the same before as you are after gaining that knowledge. Das elyon, though, the supernal level of knowledge, is in a way of yodua. Everything is known. You're not invested into the knowledge. And even though Das Elyon knows all of the details, like we say on Rosh Hashanah, everyone passes before Hashem, kivnei maroin, either like sheep or like soldiers, and Hashem sees us all in one glance, which is the idea that Hashem knows every single detail. Furthermore, our rabbis tell us that before you even think a thought in your own mind, it's already known to Hashem, Yodua. But this type of knowledge, Yodua, it is known, is not that Hashem is invested in it, but that it's automatically known and therefore causes no change. Based on this explanation, the Alter Rebbe also says in a different Maimer, asks a question, if Hashem knows all of our thoughts, isn't that like machshavas tzaros for Hashem? What, Hashem's mind is filled with all sorts of rubbish, whatever we humans think about? And he explains that no, because Hashem's knowledge of those thoughts are in a way of yodua. He doesn't get involved in it, and therefore doesn't really affect him. Similarly, the way Yosef was in the world in Mitzrayim, but wasn't affected in his avodas Hashem. And the Rebbe says furthermore that we find this even in later generations by other leaders of the Jewish people. For example, the Baal Shem Tov, that there was absolutely no contradiction being in this world, but still remaining in upper realms. And as the Mittel Rebbe explains elsewhere, that the Baal Shem Tov actually davened several times to have the ability to answer people their questions, while at the same time remaining in a state of aliyas neshama. That even though when it comes to answering a question, you need to know all the details of the question, you need to be involved in this world, nonetheless, at the same time, you should still stay in a high standing in upper realms. And he explains that on Shabbos, the Baal Shem Tov would be 2/3 above and only 1/3 below. However that actually worked, or whatever that means, we see that the Baal Shem Tov was simultaneously above even as he was below, whereas on the weekday it was the opposite, that he was 2/3 below and 1/3 above. Nonetheless, the very fact that this happened not just on Shabbos but during the week means that this is who the Baal Shem Tov was. It wasn't Shabbos that did it, but the Baal Shem Tov was a type of person who, while he was down below, was still connected, not just connected, but still stayed on a higher plane. And the same way it is by Yosef, where in Mitzrayim he wasn't affected in his avodas Hashem by his surroundings. And similar to the Eibishter, who is Golui v'Yadua, who it is known to him. And the Rebbe adds similarly, this is by other tzaddikim, shedoimim lebayram, this is by all the tzaddikim, and therefore they are able to also, tzaddikim, answer the questions of many people and still not be affected by the world. They're able to stay up l'mayla while they deal with things down lamata. Ois Ches, after explaining that the Orein Soif, even when it comes down, doesn't have a shinoi, and like Yosef, who even in Mitzrayim still remained a tzaddik, the Rebbe goes on and he quotes again from the Frierdiker Rebbe's Maimer that the reason why the Or doesn't change is because Einoi Misarev, it doesn't really mix in and become part of where it is. And that's not because, explains the Rebbe, that there is a huge gap between the Or and what it is coming down into. And the proof is because we see the Neshama and the Guf, although there's also a huge gap between them, that they're completely opposites and need a special koyach to connect them, nonetheless, the Neshama and the Guf are affected one from the other. The reason the Or isn't affected because it's not misarif. It doesn't really mix in and connect in the same way. And the Rebbe brings that this is what it says in the Zohar, Ein Kadosh ka Hashem, there is none as holy as Hashem. And the Zohar says that there are many things, Kama Kadishin Inun, many things that are holy, V'leis Kadosh ka Hashem, but none of them are as holy as Hashem. The word Kadosh normally means separate, muvdal. There are many other things that are separate, that don't come into Islamishus, that don't really involve themselves and enclose themselves into the worlds below. However, when they do, they are then in a level of tfisa, they are mixed, they're become grasped over there, and they're affected by their place. Whereas Hashem, not only is he above and separate, but even when he comes bihislabshus, even when he comes enclosed and invested in something, he is still over there, not in a level of tfisa, not really held down by it, because Einoi Misarav, it also doesn't mix in. Just like an example of light which shines through a glass, and even though the glass, there may be different colored glass, right? Nevertheless, the light still remains a simple light. And even though it's bihislamshus, it's involved and invested, and the proof is that it comes out the other side with a green or red color. Nonetheless, the Or itself is not affected because it's not misarif. And that's the same thing, says the Rebbe, with the Or and the Chayis that gives life to the world. It isn't changed because it's Ein Soif. It itself is infinite, and wherever it goes, it doesn't change and isn't affected because it doesn't mix in. And this, says the Rebbe, is what the Rebbe Rashab explains elsewhere, the difference between Or and Koyach. That some of the highest powers of a person, for example, Seichel, Chachma, they are not a Or Pasha, they are not Or, but rather they are a Koyach, which is why they are able to have change. Like we see in Seichel, there are different types of Seichel. There's a more deeper Seichel, there's a more external, superficial Seichel, and the Rebbe brings a proof that the differences in the Seichel isn't because of the mind that is more refined or less refined and can understand more or less, but rather the Seichel itself is a type of level which has change. And that's why it's possible that a person can sometimes first understand things, the depth of something, before understanding all the superficial and external levels, because the Seichel itself has changes. And based on that, the Rebbe says, however, Or is not koyach, and therefore there is no real change in the Or. And even though we can see that there are different types of Or, there's light, for example, that is light from the sun, there is light from the moon, there's light from a candle, light from a torch. So we see there's different types of light. Says the Rebbe, that's not called a shinoi in the Or. That's one type of Or, there's different types of Or, but in each Or itself, they are all the unchangeable. And even though the sunlight we see does change when it comes into this world, it doesn't shine quite as brightly as it does in its source, and therefore seemingly that is a change. Says the Rebbe, even that is not a real change, it's simply because the sun is a creation and is also limited. Furthermore, the atmosphere affects the way the sun shines. However, all light, once it comes down, it isn't affected by its surroundings, because Eina Mis'arev, it doesn't mix in. The final ois of the Maimer ois Tes, and with it the Rebbe begins that this Perek, the 14th Perek of the Friedrich Rebbe's Maimer, concludes as follows. The Friedrich Rebbe says that this is what it means, Lamata Lamata Adin Tachlis, that the Or Ein Soif goes down below with no end, meaning to say that the way it expands, it reaches even the lowest of levels. In the following prakim of the Friedrich Rebbe's Maimer, he then explains what it means, Lemaila Adin Kates, how the Or also expands upwards and is upwards as well, and there too it's in an infinite way. However, says the Rebbe, and this is really one of the main nekudas here in this Maimer, that both these levels, Lemaila and Lemata, are still all within the realm of Or. It's a revelation. It's an expansion from Hashem. However, the oitzer, the treasure which Hashem gives in order to fight the war, the whole idea of the oitzer, of the treasure, is not a revelation, but it's a treasure that has been concealed and hidden. It is something beyond the revelation, meaning to say that as great as this or is that we've been discussing and how far it goes and how it doesn't change and how it doesn't mix, that as great as it is not what the Eibishter gives us. The Eibishter gives us a level way beyond that. And this treasure, this oitzer, this hidden treasure of Hashem is given to every Jew because he is part of Tzivos Hashem, and this koyach is given to us to go out to war, first to battle within ourselves, the Yetzer Hara, and in a way, says the Rebbe, like the Gemara says, that Lecha Hashem hanetzach, that for you Hashem is victory. That victory, the Gemara expounds, means the building of Yerushalayim. That means that each Jew has to have his own victory, his own Yerushalayim to be built. And as Chassidus explains, that Yerushalayim is from the word Yira, Shalom, a complete fear of Hashem, and this victory is done, like we mentioned before, through Mesiras Nefesh, that is beyond one's intellect, and this is why also we find in the Gemara that Yiras Shamayim is called Oitzer Shal Yiras Shamayim. It is a treasure, a treasury of Yiras Shamayim, because it is something that is way beyond, because every Yid has a neshama which is a part of Hashem, a part of Yechida, which receives from the Yachid, from the Eibishter himself, and therefore when a Jew takes this treasure he has and he uses it out in Mesiras Nefesh, and then he is able to be victorious in his war, then he also causes above that Hashem should give his oitzers, his treasures from above, that Hashem should give us everything we need, even beyond the Orein Soif, this level of oitzer. The Rebbe ties this in to the idea of what the Medrash says about a king who came into a certain province, and he came with his generals and his captains and his commanders, and there were different people there. One said, I will take the generals to my home, I will take the captains, I will choose the commanders. There was one, says the Medrash, wise man who said, I will choose the king. And the idea is that we want Hashem himself. This is like the oitzer, beyond the revelation, we want the essence. And the Rebbe says, like we find also by the Alter Rebbe, that he was known, he would say, Mili v'shamayim v'imcha lechafatzti ba'aretz, quote Tehillim, who is for me in heaven, and with you I desire nothing in earth. That the Alter Rebbe would often say that I don't want your Gan Eden, not above, I don't want your Gan Eden below, but I want nothing more than you, yourself, the Eibishter himself. And this, says the Rebbe, is what is demanded from every Jew, that he should want the Eibishter, the essence, beyond the light, beyond the revelation, beyond the greatest levels. It could be Lamata din Tachlis, Lamaila din Kates, but that's all revelation. We want Hashem. And when a Jew is able to fulfill through his avodah, not to be affected by the falseness of the world, and on the contrary, through his Mesiras Nefesh, the shtus, the kedusha, doing kedusha things in a way beyond logic and beyond seichel, then he is able to not only ignore the falseness of the world, but he's able to transform the world into a keresh, into a beam, into part of the Mishkan, into, like it says, v'shachanti b'soichem, I will dwell within them, that you are able to create first within yourself and then within the world a dwelling place for Hashem. And as Chassidus explains, that the idea of a dwelling place is where the very essence of a person can be found in a revealed way, and that's what we want to create within ourselves and then within the world, a place for the essence of Hashem to be revealed and open.